And Quiet Flows the Dawn by Mikhail Sholokhov continued. Do you hear? And you're going with me. Griegor led the saddled horses to the palisade and whistled the dogs. Listnitsky came out, attired in a jerkin of blue cloth and girdled with an ornamental leather belt. A nickel cork-lined flask was slung at his back. The whip hanging from his arm trailed behind him like a snake. As he held the rein for his master to mount, Griegor was astonished at the ease with which old Listnitsky hoisted his bony body into the saddle. Keep close behind me, the general curtly ordered, as he gathered the reins in his gloved hand. Griegor rode the stallion. It was not shod on the hind hoofs, and as it trod on the shards of ice, it slipped and sat on its hind quarters. It called for strong use of the bridle, for it arched its short neck and glanced askance at its rider, trying to bite his knees. When they reached the top of the hill from Yagodnoye, Listnitsky put his horse into a fast trot. The chain of hounds followed Griegor. One black old bitch ran with her muzzle touching the end of the stallion's tail. The horse tried to reach her by falling back on its hind quarters, but the bitch dropped behind, giving Griegor a yearning, grandmotherly glance. They reached their objective, the Alshansky ravine, in half an hour. Listnitsky rode through the undergrowth along the brow of the ravine. Griegor dropped down into the valley, cautiously avoiding the numerous holes. From time to time he looked up, and through the steely blue of a straggling and naked alder grove, he saw Listnitsky's clearly defined figure standing in the stirrups. Behind him the hounds were running in a bunch along the undulating ridge. Pulling off his glove, Griegor fumbled in his pocket for some cigarette paper, thinking to have a smoke. "After him!" A shout came like a pistol shot from the other side of the ridge. Griegor raised his head and saw Listnitsky galloping along with upraised whip. "After him!" Crossing the rushy and reedy bottom of the ravine, slipping along with body close to the ground, a shaggy, dirty brown wolf was running swiftly. Leaping the bed of the stream, he stopped, and turning quickly, caught sight of the dogs. They were coming after him stretched in horseshoe formation, to cut him off from the wood at the end of the ravine. With a springy stride, the wolf made for the wood. The old bitch came almost straight towards him, another hound behind her. The wolf hesitated for a moment, and as Griegor rode up out of the ravine, he lost sight of him. When next he had a good view from a hillock, the wolf was far away in the steppe, making for a neighboring ravine. Griegor could see the hounds running through the undergrowth behind it, and old Listnitsky riding slightly to the side, plying his horse with the butt of his whip. As the wolf reached the ravine, the hounds were beginning to overtake him, and one was almost on top of the hunted animal. Griegor put his horse into a gallop, vainly trying to see what was happening ahead of him. His eyes were streaming with tears, and his ears were deafened by the whistling wind. He was suddenly possessed by the excitement of the hunt. Bending over his horse's neck, he flew along like the wind. When he reached the ravine, neither wolf nor dogs were to be seen. A moment or two later, Listnitsky overtook him. Reining in his horse sharply, he shouted, "Which way did they go?" "Into the ravine, I think." "You overtake them from the left. After them." The old man dug his heels into his horse's flanks and rode off to the right. Griegor dropped into a hollow, and with whip and shout rode his horse hard for a good mile. The damp, sticky earth flew up under the hoofs, striking him on the face. The long ravine bent to the right and branched into three. Griegor crossed the first fork and caught sight of the dark chain of hounds chasing the wolf across the steppe. The animal had been headed off from the heart of the ravine, which was densely overgrown with oaks and alders, and was now making for a dry, brush and thistle-covered valley. Rising in his stirrups and wiping the tears from his eyes with his sleeve, Griegor watched them. Glancing momentarily to the left, he realized that he was in the steppe close to his native village. Nearby lay the irregular square of land which he and Natalya had plowed in the autumn. He deliberately guided the stallion across the patch, and during the few moments in which the animal was sliding and stumbling over the clods, the zest for the hunt died to ashes within him. He now calmly urged on the heavily sweating horse, and glancing round to see whether Listnitsky was looking, dropped into an easy trot. Some distance away, he could see the empty camping quarters of plowers. A little farther off, 3 pair of bullocks were dragging a plow across the fresh, velvety soil. From the village, surely. Whose land is that? That's not Anikushka, is it? Gregor screwed up his eyes as he recognized the man following the plow. He saw 2 Cossacks drop the plow and run to head off the wolf from the nearby ravine. One, in a peaked, red-banded cap, chin strap under his chin, was waving an iron bar. Suddenly the wolf squatted down in a deep furrow. The foremost hound flew right over him and fell with its forelegs tucked beneath it. The old bitch following tried to stop, her hindquarters scraping along the cloddy, plowed ground, but unable to halt in time, she tumbled against the wolf. The hunted animal shook his head violently, and the bitch ricocheted off him. Now the mass of hounds fastened on the wolf, and they all dragged for some yards over the plowed land. Gregor was off his horse half a minute before his master. He fell to his knees, his hand on his hunting knife. "There, in the throat," the Cossack with the iron bar cried in a voice which Gregor knew well. Panting heavily, he ran up and lay down at Gregor's side, and dragging away the hound which had fastened on the hunted animal's belly, tied the wolf's forelegs with a cord. Gregor felt under the animal's shaggy fur for its windpipe and drew the knife across it. The dogs! The dogs! Drive them off!" old Lisnitsky cried as he dropped from his saddle. Gregor managed with difficulty to drive away the dogs, then glanced towards his master. Standing a little way off was Stepan Astachov. His face working strangely, he was turning the iron bar over and over in his hands. "Where are you from, my man?" Lisnitsky turned to Stepan. "From Tatarsk," Stepan answered after a momentary hesitation, and he took a step in Gregor's direction. "What's your name?" Lisnitsky asked. "Astachov." "When are you going home, my lad?" "Tonight." "Bring us that carcass." Lisnitsky pointed to the wolf with his foot. "I'll pay whatever it costs." He wiped the sweat from his purple face with his scarf, turned away, and slipped the flask off his back. Gregor went to his stallion. As he set foot in the stirrup, he glanced back. Trembling uncontrollably, Stepan was coming towards him, pressing his great heavy hands against his chest. He walked up to the horse and seized the stirrup, pressing himself right against the stallion's side. "You're looking well, Gregor," Stepan said. "Praise be. What are your thoughts about it, huh?" "What is it I'm to think about? You've carried off another man's wife, and you're having your will of her. Let go of the stirrup. Don't be afraid, I won't beat you." "I'm not afraid. Stop that talk." Gregor flushed and raised his voice. "I shan't fight you today. I don't want to. But mark my words, Grishka. Sooner or later I shall kill you." "We shall see," said the blind man. "Mark my words well. You've brought shame on me. You've castrated my life as if I were a pig. You see there?" He stretched out his hands, palms upward. "I'm plowing, and the Lord knows what for. Do I need it for myself? I could shift around a bit and get through the winter that way. It's only the dreariness of it all that gets me down. You've brought terrible shame on me, Gregor. Don't complain to me. I shan't understand. The full man doesn't understand the hungry." "That's true," Stepan agreed, staring up into Gregor's face. And suddenly he broke into a simple, boyish smile, which wrinkled the corners of his eyes into tiny furrows. "I'm sorry only for one thing, lad. Very sorry. You remember how the year before last we boxed together at Shrovetide?" "No, I don't." "Why, it was when the single men fought the married. Do you remember? And how I chased after you? You were thinner then. A green rush is against me. I spared you that time. But if I'd hit you as you were running away, I'd have split you in two. You ran quickly, all springy-like. If I'd struck you hard on the side, you would not have been alive in the world today. Don't grieve over it. We may yet come up against each other." Stepan rubbed his forehead with his hand as though trying to recall something. Still holding the stirrup with his left hand, he walked alongside the stallion. Gregor watched his every movement. He noticed Stepan's drooping flaxen mustaches, the heavy scrub of his long, unshaven chin. His dirty face, marked with whiter runnels of sweat, was sad and strangely unfamiliar. As he looked, Gregor felt that he might well be gazing from a hilltop at the distant steppe veiled in a rainy mist. A gray weariness and emptiness ashened Stepan's features. He dropped behind without a word of farewell. Gregor touched up his horse into a canter. "Wait a bit. And how is Axinia?" Knocking a lump of earth off his boot with the whip, Gregor replied, "Oh, she's all right." He halted the stallion and glanced back. Stepan was standing with his feet planted wide apart, chewing a piece of twig between his teeth. For a moment, Gregor had a feeling of immeasurable pity for him, but jealousy rose uppermost. Turning in his saddle, he shouted, "She doesn't yearn for you, don't worry." "Is that so?" Gregor brought the whip down between his horse's ears and rode away without replying. The night before Easter Sunday, the sky was overcast with masses of black cloud, and rain began to fall. A raw darkness enveloped Tatarsk. At dusk, the ice of the dawn began to crack with a protracted, rolling groan, and crushed by a mass of broken ice, the first floe emerged from the water. The ice broke suddenly over a length of 3 miles and drifted downstream. The floes crashed against one another and against the banks, to the sound of the church bell ringing measuredly for the service. At the first bend, where the Don sweeps to the left, the ice was dammed up. The roar and scraping of the moving floes reached the village. The lads had gathered in the church enclosure. Through the open doors came the muffled tones of the service. Light streamed gaily through the windows, whilst outside in the darkness the lads surreptitiously tickled and kissed the girls, and whispered dirty stories to one another. From the dawn came a flowing whisper, rustle and crunch, as though a strongly built, gaily dressed woman as tall as a poplar were passing by, her great invisible skirts rustling. At midnight, Mitka Korshunov, riding a horse bareback, clattered through the Egyptian darkness up to the church. He tied the reins to the horse's mane, and with a smack of the hand on her flanks, sent her back home. He listened to the sound of the hoofs for a moment, then, adjusting his belt, he went into the church. At the porch he removed his cap, bent his head devoutly, and thrusting aside the women, pressed up to the altar. The Cossacks were crowded in a black mass on the left. On the right was an azure throng of women. Mitka found his father in the front row, and seizing him by the elbow, whispered into his ear, "Father, come outside for a moment." As he pressed out of the church through the dense curtain of mingled odors, Mitka's nostrils quivered. He was overwhelmed by the vapor of burning wax, the stench of women's sweaty bodies, the deathly odor of long-lying clothes brought out only at Christmas and Easter time, the smell of damp leather, naphthalene, and other indistinguishable scents. In the porch, Mitka put his mouth close to his father's ear and said, "Natalya is dying." On Easter Friday, the women gathered in the hut of Korshunov's neighbor, Pelagia Majdanikov, for a talk. Her husband, Gavrila, had written from Lodz that he was trying to get furlough for Easter. Pelagia had whitewashed the walls and tidied up the hut as early as the Monday before Easter, and from Thursday onward she waited expectantly, running to the gate and standing at the fence, straight-haired and gaunt, the signs of her pregnancy showing in her face. Shading her eyes with her palm, she stared down the road. Perhaps he was coming? She was pregnant, but lawfully so. Gavrila had returned from his regiment the previous year, bringing his wife a present of Polish chintz. He had spent 4 nights with his wife, and on the 5th day had got drunk, cursed in Polish and German, and with tears in his eyes had sat singing an old Cossack song about Poland. His friends and brothers had sat with him, singing and drinking vodka before dinner. After dinner he had said goodbye to his family and had ridden off. And from that day Pelagia had begun to watch the hem of her skirt. She explained to Natalya Korshunov how she came to be pregnant. "A day or 2 before Gavrila arrived, I had a dream," she said. "I was going through the meadow, and I saw our old cow in front of me, the one we sold last August. She was walking along, and milk was dripping from her teats. Lord, I thought, however did I come to milk her so badly? Next day, old woman Drozdicha came for some hops, and I told her my dream. And she told me to break a piece of wax off a candle, roll it into a ball, and to take and bury it in some cow dung, for Misfortune was watching at the window. I ran to do as she said, but I couldn't find the candle. I had had one, I knew, but the children had taken it, or else the cockroaches had eaten it. Then Gavrila arrived, and the Misfortune with him. Before that I had gone for 3 years without trouble, and now look at me." She thrust her fingers into her belly. Pelagia fretted whilst waiting for her husband. She was bored with her own company, and so on the Friday she invited her women neighbors to come and spend the evening with her. Natalya came with an unfinished stocking, for when spring came, Granddad Grishaka felt the cold all the more. She was unnaturally full of high spirits and laughed more than necessary at the others' jokes, trying to hide her yearning for her husband from them. Pelagia was sitting on the stove with her bare violet-veined legs dangling and bantering the young and shrewish Frosya. "How was it you beat your husband, Frosya?" she asked. "Don't you know how? On the back, on the head, and wherever I could lay my hands on him." "I didn't mean that, but why you did it?" "I had to," Frosya answered unwillingly. "If you were to catch your husband with another woman, would you keep your tongue quiet?" a gaunt woman asked deliberately. "Tell us about it, Frosya." "There's nothing to tell." "Don't be afraid. We're all friends here." Spitting out a sunflower seed husk into her hand, Frosya smiled. "Well, I'd noticed his goings-on for a long time, and then someone told me he was at the mill with a loose woman from across the Don. I went out and found them by the—" "Any news of your husband, Natalya?" another woman interrupted, turning to Natalya. "He's at Yagodnaya," she replied in a whisper. "Do you think to live with him or not?" "She might think to, but he doesn't," their hostess intervened. Natalya felt the hot blood surging to her face. She bent her head over her stocking and glanced from beneath her eyelids at the women. Realizing that she could not hide her flush of shame from them, she deliberately, yet so clumsily that everybody noticed it, sent the ball of wool rolling from her knees, and then bent down and fumbled with her fingers over the cold floor. "Spit on him, woman. He would only be a yoke to you," one woman advised her with unconcealed pity in her voice. Natalya's artificial animation died away like a spark in the wind. The women's conversation turned to the latest scandal, to tittle-tattle and gossip. Natalya knitted in silence. She forced herself to sit on until the party broke up, and then went home, turning over an unformulated decision in her mind. Shame for her uncertain situation, for she still would not believe that Gregor had gone forever and was ready to forgive him and take him back, drove her on to a further step. She resolved to send a letter secretly to him in order to learn whether he had gone altogether or whether he was changing his mind. When she reached home, she found Grishaka sitting in his little room, reading an old leather-bound, grease-stained copy of the Gospels. Her father was in the kitchen, mending a fishing net. Her mother had put the children to bed and was asleep on the stove. Natalya took off her jacket and wandered aimlessly from room to room. She stopped for a moment in her grandfather's room, staring listlessly at the pile of devotional books under the icons. "Granddad, have you any paper?" she asked him. "What sort of paper?" Grishaka asked, puckering his forehead into frowns. "Paper to write on." The old man fumbled in a psalter and drew out a crumpled sheet of paper that smelt strongly of incense. "And a pencil?" "Ask your father. Go away, my dear, and don't bother." She obtained a stump of pencil from her father and sat down at the table, laboriously formulating her long-pondered thought and evoking a numb, gnawing pain in her heart. "Gregor Pantelyevich, tell me, will you, how I am to live and whether my life is quite lost or not. You left home and you didn't say a single word to me. I haven't done you any wrong, and I waited for you to untie my hands and to say that you have gone for good, but you've gone away and are as silent as the grave. I thought you had gone off in the heat of the moment, and waited for you to come back. But I don't want to part you. Better one should be trodden into the ground than two. Have pity at last and write. Then I shall know what to think. But now I stand in the middle of the road. Don't be angry with me, Grishka, for the love of Christ. Natalya." Next morning she promised Getka vodka and persuaded him to ride with the letter to Yagodnaya. Moody with expectation of his promised drink, Getka led a horse into the yard, and without informing Miran Grigorievich, rode off to Yagodnaya. He returned in the afternoon. He brought with him a piece of blue sugar-bag paper, and as he drew it out of his pocket, he winked at Natalya. "The road was terrible. I got such a shaking that it upset my kidneys," he informed her. Natalya read the letter, and her face turned gray. The 4 words scribbled on the paper entered her heart like sharp teeth rending a weave. "Live alone, Gregor Melyukov." Hurriedly, as though not trusting her own strength, Natalya went into the house and lay down on her bed. Her mother was lighting the stove for the night in order to have the place tidy early on Easter Sunday morning, and to get the Easter curd cake ready in time. "Natalya, come and give me a hand," she called to her daughter. "I've got a headache, Mama. I'll lie a little longer." Her mother put her head in at the door. "A fine time to fall sick," she remarked. Natalya licked her cold lips with her dry tongue and made no reply. She lay until evening, her head covered with a warm woolen shawl, a light tremor shaking her huddled body. Miran Grigorievich and Grishaka were about to go off to church when she got up and went into the kitchen. Beads of perspiration shone on the strands of her smoothly combed hair. Her eyes were dim with an unhealthy, oily film. As Miran Grigorievich buttoned up the long row of buttons on his trousers, he glanced at his daughter. "You've fallen ill suddenly, daughter. Come along with us to the service." "You go. I'll come along later," she replied. The men went out. Lukinichna and Natalya were left in the kitchen. Natalya went listlessly backward and forward from the chest to the bed, looked with unseeing eyes through the heap of clothing in the chest, painfully thinking of something, her lips whispering. Lukinichna thought she could not make up her mind which clothes to wear, and with motherly kindness she suggested, "Wear my blue skirt, my dear. It will just fit you. Shall I get it for you?" "No, I'll go in this." Natalya carefully drew out her green skirt, and suddenly remembered that she had been wearing it when Gregor first visited her as her future bridegroom, when he had shamed her with a flying kiss. Shaking with sobs, she fell breast forward against the raised lid of the chest. "Natalya, what's the matter?" Her mother clapped her hands. Natalya choked down her desire to scream, and mastering herself, laughed with a grating wooden laugh. "I'm all unwell today." "Oh, Natalya, I've noticed." "Well, and what have you noticed, Mamma?" she cried with unexpected irritation, crumpling the green skirt in her fingers. "You're not well at all. You need a husband." "Enough of that talk. I've had one." She went to her room and quickly returned to the kitchen, dressed, girlishly slender, her face an azure pallor, a mournful flush in her cheeks. "You go on. I'm not ready yet," her mother said. Pushing a handkerchief into her sleeve, Natalya went out. The wind brought the rumble of the floating ice and the scent of the damp thaw to her nostrils. Holding up her skirt in her left hand, picking her way across the pearly blue puddles, she reached the church. On the way, she attempted to recover her former comparatively tranquil state of mind, thinking of the holiday, of everything vaguely and in snatches. But her thoughts turned straight back to the scrap of blue sugar-bag paper hidden at her breast, to Gregor and the happy woman who was now condescendingly laughing at her, perhaps even pitying her. As she entered the church enclosure, some lads barred her way. She passed round them and heard the whisper, "Whose is she? Did you see? It was Natalya Korshunov. She's ruptured, they say. That's why her husband left her." "That's not true. She got playing about with her father-in-law, lame Pantaleimon." "Ah, so that's it. And that's why Gregor ran away from home." Stumbling over the uneven stones, followed by a shameful, filthy whisper, she reached the church porch. The girls standing in the porch giggled as she turned and made her way to the farther gate. Swaying drunkenly, she ran home. At the yard gate, she took breath and then entered, stumbling over the hem of her skirt, biting her lips till the blood came. Through the lilac darkness, the open doorway of the shed yawned blackly. With evil determination, she gathered her last strength, ran to the door, and hastily stepped across the threshold. The shed was dry and cold, smelling of leather harness and long-lying straw. Gropingly, without thought or feeling, in a somber yearning which scratched at her shamed and despairing soul, she made her way to a corner. There she picked up a scythe by the handle, removed the blade, her movements were deliberately assured and precise, and throwing back her head with all the force and joyous resolution that possessed her, she slashed her throat with its point. She fell as though struck down before the burning, savage pain, and mournfully realizing that she had not completely carried out her intention, she struggled onto all fours, then onto her knees. Hurriedly, she was terrified by the blood pouring over her chest, with trembling fingers, she tore off the buttons of her jacket, and with one hand she drew aside her taut, unyielding breast. With the other she guided the point of the scythe over the floor. She crawled on her knees to the earthen wall, thrust the blunt end of the scythe blade into it, and throwing her arms above her head, pressed her chest firmly forward. She clearly heard and felt the resisting, cabbage-like scrunch of the rending flesh. A rising wave of intense pain flowed over her breast to her throat, and pressed with ringing needles into her ears. The kitchen door scraped. Lukinichna came down the stairs, feeling for the steps with her feet. From the belfry came the measured beat of the church bell. With an incessant grinding, the giant floes were floating end up down the Don. The joyous, full-flowing, liberated river was carrying its icy fetters away down to the Sea of Azov. Chapter 12. Axinia confessed her pregnancy to Gregor only during the 6th month, when she was no longer able to conceal it from him. She had kept silent so long because she was afraid he would not believe it was his child she was carrying. She told him agitatedly one evening, anxiously scanning his face the while for any change in its expression, but he turned away to the window and coughed with vexation. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he demanded. "I was afraid to, Gregor. I thought you might throw me over." Drumming his fingers on the back of the bed, he asked, "Is it to be soon?" "The beginning of August, I think." "Is it Stepan's?" "No, it's yours." "So you say." "Reckon up for yourself. From the day of the woodcutting it is." "Don't lie, Axinia. Even if it was Stepan's, where would you go to now?" Weeping angry tears, Axinia sat down on the bench and broke into a burning whisper. "I've lived with him so many years and nothing ever happened. Think for yourself. I'm not an ailing woman. I must have got it from you. And you—" Gregor talked no more about the matter. A new thread of anxious aloofness and a light mocking pity entered into his attitude to Axinia. She withdrew into herself, asking for no favors. Since the summer she had lost her good looks, but pregnancy hardly affected her shapely figure. Her general fullness concealed her condition, and although her face was thinner, it gained a new beauty from her warmly glowing eyes. She easily managed her work as cook, especially as that year fewer laborers were employed on the farm. Eugene had arranged for Gregor to be freed from the spring training camp, and he worked at the mowing, occasionally drove old Lisnitsky to the district center, and spent the rest of the time hunting with him after bustards. The easy-going, comfortable life began to spoil him. He grew lazy and stout and looked older than his years. He was troubled only by the thought of his forthcoming army service. He had neither horse nor equipment, and he could hope for nothing from his father. He saved the wages he received for himself and Axinia, and spent nothing even on tobacco, hoping to be able to buy a horse without having to beg from his father. Old Lisnitsky also promised to help him. Gregor's presentiment that his father would give him nothing was quickly confirmed. At the end of June, Pyotr visited his brother, and in the course of conversation mentioned that his father was as angry with him as ever, and had declared that he would not help him to get a horse. "Let him go to the local command for one," he had said. "He needn't worry. I'll go to do my service on my own horse," Gregor declared, stressing "my own." "Where will you get it from?" Pyotr asked. "I'll beg for it or dance for it, and if I don't get it that way, I'll steal it." "Brave lad. I shall buy a horse with my wages," Gregor said more seriously. Pyotr sat on the steps asking about Gregor's work and chewing the ends of his mustache. Having completed his inquiries, as he turned to go, he said to his brother, "You should come back. There's no point in knocking your head against a brick wall." "I'm not intending to." "Are you thinking of staying with her?" "With who?" "With this one." "At present I am, but what of it?" "Oh, I'm just interested." As Gregor went to see his brother off, he had to ask at last, "How is everything at home?" Pyotr laughed as he untied his horse from the balustrade of the steps. "You've got as many homes as a rabbit has holes. Everything is all right. Your mother longs to see you. We've got in the hay, 3 loads of it." Agitatedly, Gregor scanned the old mare his brother was riding. "No foal this year?" he inquired. "No, brother. She's barren. But the bay which we got from Kristonia has foaled. A stallion it is, a good one, too. High on the legs, sound pasterns, and strong in the chest. It'll be a good horse." Gregor sighed. "I pine for the village, Pyotr," he said. "I pine for the dawn. You never see running water here. It's a dreary place." "Come and see us," Pyotr replied as he hoisted his body onto the mare's bony spine. "Someday. Well, goodbye. A good journey." Pyotr had ridden out of the yard when, remembering something, he called to Gregor, who was still standing on the steps. "Natalya! I'd forgotten. A misfortune." The wind, blowing round the farm, carried the end of the sentence away from Gregor's ears. Pyotr and the horse were enveloped in velvety dust, and Gregor shrugged his shoulders and went off to the stables. The summer was dry. Rain fell but rarely, and the corn ripened early. As soon as the rye was garnered, the barley was ripe and yellow. The 4 day laborers and Gregor went out to reap it. Axinia had finished work early that day, and she asked Gregor to take her with him. Despite his attempt to dissuade her, she quickly threw a kerchief over her head, ran out, and caught up with the wagon in which the men were riding. The event which Axinia anticipated with yearning and joyous impatience, which Gregor awaited with apprehension, happened during the harvesting. Feeling certain symptoms, she threw down the rake and lay under a stook. Her travail came on quickly. Biting her blackened tongue, she lay flat on the ground. The laborers with the reaping machine drove in a circle around her. As they passed, one of them called out to her, "Hey, you've lain yourself down to bake in an awkward spot, haven't you? Get up or you'll melt." Gregor got one of the men to take his place at the machine and went across to her. "What's the matter?" he asked. Her lips writhing uncontrollably, she said hoarsely, "I'm in labor." "I told you not to come, you devilish bitch. Now what are we to do?" "Don't be angry with me, Grishka." Oh, Grishka, harness the horse to the wagon. I must get home." "How could I? Here, with the Cossacks," she groaned, gripped in an iron band of pain. Gregor ran for the horse. It was grazing in a hollow a little way off, and by the time he drove up, Axinia had struggled onto all fours, thrust her head into a pile of dusty barley, and was spitting out the prickly beards she had chewed in her pain. She fixed her dilated eyes vacantly on Gregor and set her teeth into her crumpled handkerchief to prevent the laborers from hearing her horrible, rending cry. Gregor tumbled her into the wagon and drove the horse fast towards the estate. "Oh, don't hurry! Oh, death! You're shaking me!" Axinia screamed as her head knocked on the bottom of the wagon. Gregor silently plied the whip and swung the reins around his head without a glance back at her. Pressing her cheeks with her palms, her staring, frenzied eyes rolling wildly, Axinia bounced about in the wagon, tumbling from side to side over the bumpy, unworn road. Gregor kept the horse at a gallop. For a moment, Axinia ceased her shrieking howl. The wheels rattled, and her head thudded heavily against the bottom board. At first, her silence did not impress itself on Gregor, but then, taking thought, he glanced back. Axinia was lying with horribly distorted face, her cheek pressed hard against the side of the wagon, her jaws working like a fish flung ashore. The sweat was pouring from her brow into her sunken eyes. Gregor turned and raised her head, putting his crumpled cap beneath it. Glancing sidelong at him, she said firmly, "I shall die, Grishka, and that's all there is to it." Gregor shuddered. A chill ran down his body to his toes. Suddenly alarmed, he sought for words of encouragement, of comfort, but could not find them. From his trembling lips came, "You're lying, you fool." He shook his head, and bending over her, awkwardly squeezed her foot. "Axinia, my little pigeon." The pain died away and left Axinia for a moment, then returned with redoubled force. Feeling something rending and bending in an arch under her belly, she pierced Gregor's ears with an inexpressibly horrible, rising scream. Gregor frantically whipped up the horse. "Oh! Ah!" Axinia shrieked in her agony. Then above the rattle of the wheels, Gregor just heard her thin, yearning voice. "Grishka!" He reined in the horse and turned his head. Axinia lay in a pool of blood, her arms flung out. Below her skirt, between her legs, a white and crimson living thing was stirring. Gregor frenziedly jumped down from the wagon and stumbled to the back. Staring into Axinia's panting, burning mouth, he rather guessed than caught the words. "Bite through the cord! Tie it with cotton from the shirt!" With trembling fingers, he tore a bunch of threads from the sleeve of his own cotton shirt, and screwing up his eyes until they pained him, he bit through the cord and carefully tied up the bleeding end with cotton. The estate of Yagodnoye lay in a spacious valley. The wind blew changeably from north or south, summer advanced on the valley, the autumn rustled with falling leaves, winter flung its forces of frost and snow against it, but Yagodnoye remained sunk in its wooden torpor. So the days passed, crawling over the high wall that cut off the estate from the rest of the world. The farmyard was always alive with black ducks wearing red spectacles. The guinea fowls scattered like a beady rain. Gaily feathered peacocks called hoarsely from the roof of the stables. The old general was fond of all kinds of birds, and even kept a maimed crane. In November, It wrung the heartstrings with its copper-tongued, yearning cry as it heard the call of the wild cranes flying to the south, but it could not fly, for one wing hung uselessly at its side. As the general stood at the window and watched the bird stretching out its neck and jumping, fluttering off the ground, he laughed, and the bass tones of his laughter rocked through the empty hall like clouds of tobacco smoke. During all the time of Gregor's stay at Yagodnoye, only two events disturbed the sleepy, monotonous life: the coming of Aksinia's child and the loss of a prize gander. The inhabitants of Yagodnoye quickly grew accustomed to the baby girl, and they found some of the gander's feathers in the meadow and concluded that a fox had carried it off. One day in December, Gregor was summoned to the district administration at Vishenska. There he was given 100 rubles to buy a horse, and was instructed to report on 2 days after Christmas at the village of Mankova for the army draft. He returned to Yagodnoye in considerable agitation. Christmas was approaching, and he had nothing ready. With the money he had received from the authorities, plus his own savings, he bought a horse for 140 rubles. He took Sashka with him, and they purchased a presentable animal enough, a 6-year-old bay with one hidden blemish. Old Sashka combed his beard with his fingers and advised, "You won't get one cheaper, and the authorities won't see the fault. They're not smart enough." Gregor rode the horse bareback to Yagodnoye, trying out its paces. A week before Christmas, Panteleimon arrived unexpectedly at Yagodnoye. He did not drive into the yard, but tied up his horse and basket sledge at the gate and limped into the servants' quarters, rubbing the icicles off his beard. As through the window he saw his father approaching, Gregor exclaimed in confusion, "Well, I'm father!" For some reason, Axinia ran to the cradle and wrapped up the child. Panteleimon entered, bringing a breath of cold air with him. He removed his 3-cornered cap and crossed himself to the icon, then gazed slowly around the room. "Good health," he greeted his son. "Good morning, father," Gregor replied, rising from the bench and striding to the center of the room. Panteleimon offered Gregor his ice-cold hand and sat down on the edge of the bench, wrapping his sheepskin around him. He would not look at Axinia. "Getting ready for your service?" he asked. "Of course." Panteleimon was silent, staring long and questioningly at Gregor. "Take your things off, father, and we'll get a samovar going." "Thank you." The old man scraped an old spot of mud off his coat with his fingernail and added, "I've brought your equipment. 2 coats, a saddle, and trousers. You'll find them all there in the sledge." Gregor went out and removed the 2 sacks of equipment from the sledge. When he returned, his father rose from the bench. "When are you going off?" he asked his son. "The day after Christmas." "You aren't going already, are you, father?" "I want to get back early." He took leave of Gregor, and, still avoiding Aksinia's eyes, went towards the door. As he lifted the latch, he turned his eyes in the direction of the cradle and said, "Your mother sends her greetings. She's in bed with trouble in her legs." After a momentary pause, he said heavily, "I shall ride with you to Mankova. Be ready when I come." He went out, thrusting his hands into warm, knitted gloves. Axinia, pale with the humiliation she had suffered, said nothing. Gregor followed his father, trying to avoid a creaking floorboard, and giving Axinia a sidelong glance as he passed. On Christmas Day, Gregor drove his master to Vishenska. And Quiet Flows the Dawn by Mikhail Sholokhov continued. On Christmas Day, Gregor drove his master to Vishenska. Listnitsky attended Mass, had breakfast with his cousin, a local landowner, and then ordered Gregor to get the sleigh ready for the return journey. Gregor had not finished his bowl of greasy soup, but he rose at once, went to the stable, and harnessed the gray trotting horse into the light sleigh. The wind was blowing the crumbling, tingling snow into spray. A silvery froth whirled hissingly through the yard. On the trees beyond the palisade hung a tender, scalloped hoarfrost. The wind sent it flying, and as it fell and scattered, it reflected a marvelous variety of colors from the sun. On the roof, close to the smoking chimney, rooks were chattering coldly. Startled by the sound of footsteps, they flew off, circled round the house like dove-colored snowflakes, then flew to the east, to the church, clearly outlined against the violet morning sky. "Tell the master we're ready," Gregor shouted to the maid that came to the steps of the house. Lisnitsky came out and entered the sleigh, his whiskers buried in the collar of his raccoon fur coat. Gregor wrapped up his legs and buttoned the shaggy wolfskin over him. They arrived at Yagodnoye within 2 hours. Lisnitsky held no communication whatever with Gregor during the journey, except for an occasional tap on the back with his finger to order him to stop while he rolled and lit a cigarette. Only as they were descending the hill to the house did he ask, "Early in the morning?" Gregor turned sideways in his seat and with difficulty opened his frozen lips. His tongue, bursting and stiff with cold, stuck to the back of his teeth. "Yes," he managed to reply. "Received all your money?" "Yes." "Don't be anxious about your wife. She'll be all right. Be a good soldier. Your grandfather was a fine Cossack. You must conduct yourself in a manner worthy of your grandfather and father. Your father received the first prize for trick riding at the Imperial Review in 1883, didn't he?" "Yes, it was my father." "Well, well," the old man ended with a stern note in his voice, as though admonishing Gregor, and he buried his face once more in his fur coat. At the yard, Gregor handed over the horse to Sashka and turned to go to the servants' quarters. "Your father's arrived," Sashka shouted after him. Gregor found Panteleimon sitting at the table eating cranberry jelly. Drunk, Gregor decided as he glanced at his father's sodden face. "So you're back, soldier," Panteleimon exclaimed. "I'm all frozen," Gregor answered, clapping his hands together. Turning to Axinia, he added, "Untie my hood. My fingers are too cold to do it." On this occasion, his father was much more affable, and told Axinia curtly, as though he were master in the house, "Cut me some more bread. Don't spare it." When he had finished, he rose from the table and went towards the door to have a smoke in the yard. As he passed the cradle, he rocked it once or twice, pretending that the action was accidental, and asked, "A Cossack?" "A girl," Axinia replied for Gregor, and catching the expression of dissatisfaction that passed over the old man's face, she hurriedly added, "She's so bonny, just like Grishka." Panteleimon attentively examined the dark little head sticking out of the clothes and declared, not without a touch of pride, "She's of our blood." "Ah, you—" "How did you come, father?" Gregor asked. "With the mare and Pyotr's horse. You need only have used one, and we could have harnessed mine for the journey to Mankova." "Let him go light. He's a good horse, too." Disturbed by the one common thought, they talked about various matters. Axinia took no part in the conversation, but sat on the bed. She had noticeably grown stouter since the birth of the child, and had a new, confidently happy air. It was late when they went to bed. As she lay pressed against Gregor, Axinia wetted his shirt with her tears. "I shall die of pining for you. How shall I be able to live without you? The long nights, the child awake. Just think, Grishka, 4 years. In the old days, service lasted 25 years, they say. What do I care about the old days? Curse your army service, say I. I shall come home on furlough." "On furlough?" Axinia groaned, blowing her nose on her shift. "Much water will flow down the Don before then." "Don't whine so. You're like rain in autumn, one continual drizzle. You should be in my skin," she retorted. Gregor fell asleep a little before dawn. Axinia got up and fed the child, then lay down again. Leaning on her elbows and gazing unwinkingly into Gregor's face, she took a long farewell of him. She recalled the night when she had tried to persuade him to go with her to the Kuban. Once more, the yard outside the window was flooded with the white light of the moon. So they had lain then, and Gregor was still the same, yet not the same. Behind them both lay a long track trodden out by the passing days. He turned over, muttered something about Alshansky village, and then was silent. Axinia tried to sleep, but her thoughts drove all sleep away like wind a haycock. Until daybreak she lay thinking over his disconnected phrase, seeking its meaning. Panteleimon awoke as soon as the faintest glimmer of daylight peered through the window. "Gregor, get up," he cried. By the time they had breakfasted and packed, dawn had fully come. Panteleimon went to harness his horses, whilst Gregor tore himself away from Aksinia's passionate kisses and went to say goodbye to Sashka and the other servants. Wrapping the child up warmly, Axinia took her out with her to take a last farewell. Gregor lightly touched his daughter's damp little forehead with his lips and went to his horse. "Come in the sledge," his father called, as he touched up his horses. "No, I'll ride my horse." With calculated deliberation, Gregor fastened the saddle girths, mounted his horse, gathered the reins in his hand. More than once Axinia repeated, "Grishka, wait! There's something I wanted to say." And puckering her brow, she tried to remember what it was. "Well, goodbye. Look after the child. I must be off. See how far Father's got already?" "Wait, dear." With her left hand, Axinia seized the icy iron stirrup. Her right arm pressed the baby to her breast, and she had no free hand with which to wipe away the tears streaming from her staring, unwinking eyes. Benjamin came to the steps of the house. "Gregor, the master wants you," he called. Gregor cursed, waved his whip, and dashed out of the yard. Axinia ran after him, stumbling in the drifted snow. He overtook his father at the top of the hill. Then he turned and looked back. Axinia was standing at the gate, the child still pressed to her breast, the ends of her crimson shawl fluttering in the wind. He rode his horse alongside his father's sledge. After a few moments, the old man turned his back to his horses and asked, "So you're not thinking of living with your wife?" "That old story again. I've already told you." "So you're not thinking—" "No, I'm not. You haven't heard that she laid hands on herself?" "Yes, I've heard. I happened to meet a man from the village." "And in the sight of God?" "Why, Father, after all, what falls from the wagon is lost. Don't use that devil's talk to me. What I'm saying to you, I'm saying for your good," Panteleimon flared up. "You see, I have a child. What is there to talk about? You can't push the other onto me now. Take care you're not feeding another man's child." Gregor turned pale. His father had touched a sore spot. Ever since the child was born, he had tormentedly nursed the suspicion in his mind, whilst concealing it from Axinia. At night, when Axinia was asleep, he had more than once gone to the cradle and stared down at the child, seeking his own features in the swarthily rosy face, and had turned back to bed as uncertain as before. Stepan also was dark red, almost black of complexion, and how was he to know whose blood flowed in the child's veins? At times he thought the child resembled him. At other times she was painfully like Stepan. Gregor had no feeling for her, except perhaps of hostility, as he recalled the moments he had lived through as he drove Axinia back from the steppe. Only once Axinia was busy elsewhere, and he had had to change the child's wet napkin. As he did so, he had felt a sharp, pinching agitation. Afterwards he had bent stealthily over the cradle and pressed the baby's great toe between his teeth. His father probed mercilessly at the wound, and Gregor, his palm resting on the saddle-bow, numbly replied, "Whosever it is, I won't leave the child." Panteleimon waved his whip at the horses without turning round. "Natalya's spoilt her good looks. She carries her head on one side like a paralytic. It seems she cut a large tendon." He lapsed into silence. "And how is she now?" Gregor asked, studiously picking a burr out of his horse's mane. "She's got over it somehow or other. She lay 7 months. On Trinity Sunday she was all but gone. Father Pancrati performed the last rites. Then she got better, rose and walked. She thrust the scythe at her heart, but her hand trembled and it missed." "Quicker up the hill," Gregor proposed, and waved his whip and outdistanced his father, sending a shower of snow from his horse's hoofs over the sledge. He broke into a trot, standing in his stirrups. "We're taking Natalya back into our home," Panteleimon shouted, chasing after him. "The woman doesn't want to live with her own folk. I saw her the other day and told her to come to us." Gregor made no reply. They drove as far as the first village without exchanging a word, and his father made no further reference to the subject. That day they covered 45 miles. They arrived at Mankova as dusk was falling the next day, and spent the night in the quarters allotted to the Vishenska recruits. Next morning, the district ataman conducted the Vishenska recruits before the medical commission. Gregor fell in with the other lads from his own village. In the morning, Mitka Korshunov, riding a high bay horse equipped with a new and gaily ornamented saddle, had passed Gregor standing at the door of his quarters. but had gone by without a word of greeting. The men undressed in turn in the cold room of the local civil administration. Military clerks bustled around, and the adjutant to the provincial ataman hurried past. From an inner room came the sound of the doctor's orders and snatches of remarks. A clerk came out and curtly called Gregor and another into the examination room. Gregor went in, his back all gooseflesh with the cold. His swarthy body was the color of oak. He was embarrassed as he glanced down at his hairy legs. The humiliating procedure of the medical examination irritated him. A gray-haired doctor in white overalls sounded him with the aid of a stethoscope. A younger doctor turned up his eyelids and looked at his tongue. Behind him a third in horn-rimmed spectacles bustled about, rubbing his hands. "On the scales," an officer ordered. Gregor stepped onto the cold platform. 13, 3.5. "What? He's not particularly tall, either," the gray-haired doctor drawled, turning Gregor round by the arm. "Astonishing," the younger man coughed. "How much?" an officer sitting at the table asked in surprise. 13 stone, 3.5 pounds, the gray-haired doctor replied. "How about the lifeguards for him?" the district military commissioner asked, bending towards his neighbor at the table. "He has a brigand's face, very savage-looking. Hey, turn round. What's that on your back?" an official wearing colonel's epaulets shouted, impatiently tapping his finger on the table. Turning to face the colonel, trying to restrain the trembling of his body, Gregor replied, "I got frozen in the spring. They're the marks." Towards the end of the examination, the officials at the table decided that Gregor would have to be drafted into an ordinary regiment. "The 12th Regiment, Melyukov, do you hear?" he was told. And as he went towards the door, he heard a whispered, "It's impossible. Just consider. The Emperor would see a face like that, and then what? His eyes alone. He's a crossbreed, from the East, undoubtedly. And his body isn't clean. Those marks." Buttoning up his coat as he went, he ran down the steps. Horses were being mustered on the square. The warm wind breathed of thaw. The road was bare in places and steaming. Clucking hens fluttered down the street. Geese were splashing in a puddle. The examination of the horses took place the following day. A long line of mounts was drawn up on the square against the church wall. A veterinary surgeon and his assistant passed along the line. The Vishenska ataman went running from the scales to the table in the middle of the square where the results of the examination were being entered. The military commissary went by, deep in conversation with a young captain. When his turn came, Gregor led his horse to the scales. The surgeon and his assistant measured every part of the animal's body and weighed it. Before it could be led from the platform, the surgeon had deftly taken it by the upper lip, looked down its throat, felt its chest muscles, and running his fine fingers like spider's legs over its body, turned to its legs. He felt the knee joints, tapped the tendons, squeezed the bone above the fetlocks. When he had finished the examination, he passed on, his white overalls flapping in the wind and scattering the scent of carbolic acid. Gregor's horse was rejected. Sashka's hopes proved unjustified, and the experienced surgeon discovered the secret blemish of which the old man had spoken. Gregor at once held an agitated consultation with his father, and before half an hour had elapsed, he led Pyotr's horse onto the scales. The surgeon passed it almost without an examination. Gregor led the horse a little way off, found a comparatively dry spot, and spread out his saddle-cloth on the ground. His father held his horse. Past them strode a tall, gray-haired general in a light gray cloak and a silver Astrakhan fur cap, followed by a group of officers. "That's the provincial ataman," Panteleimon whispered, digging Gregor from behind. Gregor stared inquisitively at the unfamiliar features of the officers and officials. An adjutant fixed a bored gaze on him and turned away as he met Gregor's attentive eyes. An old captain went by almost at a run, agitated by something, and biting his upper lip with his yellow teeth. On his saddle-cloth, Gregor had set out his saddle, adorned with a green ribbon, with its saddlebags at the pommel and the back. 2 army coats, 2 pairs of trousers, a tunic, 2 pairs of leg boots, 1.5 pounds of biscuit, a tin of corned beef, groats, and other food in the regulation quantities. In the open saddlebags were 4 horseshoes, shoe-nails wrapped in a greasy rag, a soldier's hussif with a couple of needles and thread and towels. He gave a last glance over his accoutrements, and squatted down to rub some mud off the ends of the pack strings with his sleeve. From the end of the square, the army commission slowly passed along the rows of Cossacks drawn up behind their saddle cloths. The officers and the ataman closely examined the equipment, stooping and feeling the edges of the greatcoats, fumbling in the saddlebags, turning out the contents of the hussifs, and weighing the bags of biscuit in their hands. The talk gradually died away as the commission approached. Griegor drew himself up. Behind him, his father coughed. The wind carried the scent of horses' urine and melted snow over the square. The son looked unhappy, as though after a drinking bout. The group of officers halted by the man next to Griegor, then came on to him one by one. "Your surname, Christian name?" "Melyukov, Griegor." The commissary picked up the greatcoat by its edge, smelt at the lining, and hurriedly counted the fastenings. Another officer, wearing a cornet's epaulets, felt the good cloth of the trousers between his fingers. A third stooped and rummaged in the saddlebags. With his thumb and forefinger, the commissary cautiously poked at the rag of shoe nails, as though afraid it might be hot, and counted the nails with whispering lips. "Why are there only 23 nails? What is this?" He angrily pulled at the corner of the rag. "Not at all, Your Excellency, 24. "What, am I blind?" Griegor hastily turned back a folded corner and revealed the 24th nail. As he did so, his hairy black fingers lightly touched the officer's white hand. The commissary snatched his hand away as though struck, rubbed it on the edge of his greatcoat, frowning fastidiously, and drew on his glove. Griegor noticed his action and smiled evilly. Their eyes met, and the commissary flushed and raised his voice. "What's all this? What's all this, Cossack? Why aren't your pack strings in order? Why aren't your snaffles right? And what does this mean? Are you a Cossack or a peasant? Where's your father?" Panteleimon pulled on the horse's rein and stepped forward a pace, his lame leg dragging. "Don't you know the Cossack regulations?" The commissary poured out the vials of his wrath upon him. The provincial ataman came up, and the commissary quietened down. The ataman thrust the toe of his boot into the padding of the saddle and passed on to the next man. The draft officer of the regiment, to which Griegor had been drafted, politely turned out all his belongings, down to the contents of the hussif, and passed on last of all. A day later, a train of red wagons loaded with horses, Cossacks, and forage left for Voronezh. In one of them stood Griegor. Past the open door crawled an unfamiliar flat landscape. In the distance a blue and tender thread of forest whirled by. Behind him the horses were munching hay and stepping from hoof to hoof as they felt the unstable floor beneath them. The wagon smelt of wormwood, horses' sweat, the spring thaw, and on the horizon lurked the distant thread of forest, blue, pensive, and as inaccessible as the faintly shining evening star. Chapter 13. It was on a warm and cheerful spring day of March 1914 that Natalya returned to her father-in-law's hut. Panteleimon was mending the broken wattle fence with puffy dove-colored twigs. The silvery icicles hanging from the roofs were dripping, and the traces of former runnels showed as black scratches on the cornices. The warm sun caressed the melting hills, and the earth was swelling. An early grass showed a green malachite on the chalky headlands that swept in promontories from the Donside hills. Natalya approached her father-in-law from behind, bending her mutilated, crooked neck. "Good health, father," she said. "Natyushka, welcome, my dear, welcome," Panteleimon fussed around her. The twigs dropped out of his hand. "Why haven't you been to see us? Come in. Mother will be right glad to see you." "Father, I've come." Natalya stretched out her hand uncertainly and turned away. "If you don't drive me away, I'd like to stay with you always," she added. "What then? What then, my dear? Are you a stranger to us? Look, Griegor has written about you in his letter. He's told us to ask about you." They went into the kitchen. Ilinichna wept as she embraced Natalya. Wiping her nose on the end of her kerchief, she whispered, "You want a child. That would win him. Sit down. I'll get you some pancakes, shall I?" Dunya, flushed and smiling, came running into the kitchen and embraced Natalya around the knees. "You shameless one, you forgot all about us," she reproached her. They all talked together, interrupting one another, Ilinichna supporting her cheek on her palm, grieved as she looked at Natalya, so changed from what she had been. "You've come for good?" Dunya asked as she rubbed Natalya's hands. "Who knows?" "Why, where else should she live? You'll stop with us," Ilinichna decided, as she pushed a platter of pancakes across the table. Natalya went to her husband's parents only after long vacillation. At first her father would not let her go. He shouted at her in indignation when she suggested it, and attempted to persuade her against such a step. But it was difficult for her to look her folk in the face. She felt that with her own family she was almost a stranger. For his part, after he had seen Gregor off to the army, Panteleimon was continually wheedling her to come, for he was determined to have her back, and to reconcile Gregor to her. From that day of March, Natalya lived with the Melyakovs. Pyotr was friendly and brotherly. Darya gave little outward sign of her dissatisfaction, and her occasional hostile glances were more than compensated by Dunya's attachment and the parental attitude of the old people. The very day after Natalya came to them, Panteleimon ordered Dunya to write a letter to Gregor. "Greetings, our own son, Gregor Pantelyevich. We send you a deep bow, and from all my fatherly heart, with your mother, Vasilisa Ilinichna, a parental blessing. Your brother, Pyotr Pantelyevich, and his wife, Darya Matvyevna, greet you and wish you health and well-being. Also your sister Dunya and all at home greet you. We received your letter, sent in February, the 5th day, and heartily thank you for it. And as you wrote that the horse is knocking his legs, smear him with some lard, you know how, and don't shoe his hind hoofs so long as there is no slipperiness or bare ice about. Your wife, Natalya Mironovna, is living with us and is well and comfortable. Your mother sends you some dried cherries and a pair of woolen socks, and some drippings and other things. We are all alive and well, but Darya's baby died. The other day I and Pyotr roofed the shed, and he orders you to look after the horse and keep it well. The cows have calved. The old mare seems to be in foal. We put a stallion from the district stables to her. We are glad to hear about your service, and that your officers are pleased with you. Serve as you should. Service for the Tsar will not be in vain. And Natalya will live with us now, and you think that over. And one other trouble. Just before Lent, an animal killed 3 sheep. Now keep well, and in God's keeping. Don't forget your wife. That is my order to you. She is a good woman and your legal wife. Don't break the furrow, and listen to your father. Your father, Senior Sergeant Panteleimon Melyakov." Gregor's regiment was stationed at a little place called Radzivilova, some 3 miles from the Russo-Austrian frontier. He rarely wrote home. To the letter informing him that Natalya was living with his father, he wrote a cautiously worded reply, and asked his father to greet her in his name. All his letters were non-committal and obscure in their meaning. Panteleimon required Dunya or Pyotr to read them to him several times, pondering over the thought concealed between the lines. Just before Easter, he wrote and asked Gregor definitely whether on his return from the army he would live with his wife or with Axinia as before. Gregor delayed with his reply. Only after Trinity Sunday did they receive a brief letter from him. Dunya read it quickly, swallowing the ends of her words, and Panteleimon had difficulty in grasping the essential thought among the numerous greetings and inquiries. At the end of the letter, Gregor dealt with the question of Natalya. "You asked me to say whether I shall live with Natalya or not, but I tell you, Father, you can't stick on again what has been cut off. And how shall I make up to Natalya when you know yourself that I have a child? And I can't promise anything. It is painful for me to talk about it. The other day a Jew was caught smuggling goods across the frontier, and we happened to see him. He said there would be war with the Austrians soon, and that their Tsar has come to the frontier to see where to begin the war from, and which land to seize for himself. When war begins, maybe I shan't be left alive, and nothing can be settled beforehand." Natalya worked for her foster parents and lived in continual hope of her husband's return. She never wrote to Gregor, but nobody in the family yearned with more pain and desire to receive a letter from him. Life in the village continued in its inviolable order. On work-days, the gray labor imperceptibly consumed the time. On Sunday mornings, the village poured in family droves into the church. The Cossacks in tunics and holiday trousers, the women in long, varicolored skirts that swept the dust, and little jackets with puff sleeves. On the square, the empty wagon shafts stuck high into the air, the horses whinnied. By the fire shed, the Bulgar settlers traded in fruit, set out in long rows. Behind them, the children ran about in bands, staring at the unharnessed camels, superciliously surveying the market square. Everywhere were crowds of men wearing red-banded caps, and women in bright kerchiefs. In the evening, the streets groaned with the tramp of feet, with song and dancing to the accordions, and only late at night did the last voices die away in the outskirts of the village. Natalya never went visiting neighbors on Sunday evenings, but sat listening gladly to Dunya's artless stories. Imperceptibly, Dunya was growing into a shapely and, in her way, a beautiful girl. She matured early, like an early apple. This year, her elder girlfriends forgot that they had reached adolescence before her, and took her back into their circle. She was 15 now, and her figure was still girlish and angular. She was a painful and naive mixture of childhood and blossoming youth. Her little breasts grew and pressed noticeably against her jacket, and in her long, rather slanting eye sockets, her black eyes still sparkled bashfully and mischievously. She would come back after an evening out and tell only Natalya her innocent secrets. "Natalya, I want to tell you something." "Well, tell on." "Yesterday, Misha Koshevoy sat the whole evening with me on the stump by the village granaries." "Why are you blushing?" "Oh, I'm not. Look in the glass, you're all one great flame." Dunya rubbed her burning cheeks with her swarthy palms, and her young, artless laugh rang out. "He said I was like a little azure flower." "Well, go on," Natalya encouraged her, rejoicing in another's joy, and forgetting her own past and downtrodden happiness. "And I said, 'Don't tell lies, Misha,' and he swore." Shaking her head, Natalya sent her laughter pealing through the room. The black, heavy plaits of her hair slipped like newts over her shoulders and back. "What else did he say?" "He asked me to give him my handkerchief for a keepsake." "And did you?" "No, I said I wouldn't. Go and ask your woman," I told him. "He's been seen with Yerofyevna's daughter-in-law. And she's a bad woman. She plays about with the men. You'd better keep away from him." "I'm going to." Dunya continued her story. "And then as the three of us, 2 girls and me, were coming home, drunken old Father Mihi came after us. 'Kiss me, my dears,' he shouted, and Nura hit him on the face with a twig, and we ran away." The summer was dry. By the village, the dawn grew shallow, and where the surging current had run swiftly, a ford was made, and bullocks could cross to the other bank without wetting their backs. At night, a heavy, hot exhalation flowed down from the range of hills into the village, and the wind filled the air with the strong scent of burning grass. The dry growth of the steppe was afire, and a sickly-smelling haze hung over the Donside slopes. At night, the clouds deepened over the dawn. Ominous peals of thunder were to be heard, but no rain came to refresh the parched earth, although the lightning tore the sky into jagged, livid fragments. Night after night, an owl screeched from the belfry. The cries surged terrifyingly over the village, and the owl flew from the belfry to the cemetery and groaned over the brown and grass-grown mounds of the graves. "There's trouble brewing," the old men prophesied, as they listened to the owl screeching from the cemetery. "There's war coming. An owl called just like that before the Turkish campaign. Expect no good when it flies from the church to the dead." As he talked with the old men in the marketplace, Panteleimon solemnly announced, "Our Gregor writes that the Austrian Tsar has come to the frontier and has given orders to collect all his troops in one place and to march on Moscow and Petersburg." The old man remembered past wars and shared their apprehensions with one another. "But there won't be any war," one objected. "Look at the harvest." "The harvest has nothing to do with it. It's the students giving trouble, I expect." "In any case, we shall be the last to hear of it. But who will the war be with?" "With the Turks across the sea. Depend on it. The water won't keep them apart." The talk turned to jest, and the old men went about their business. For 2 nights, Martin Shamil, who lived close to the cemetery, watched by the cemetery palisade for the accursed owl. but the invisible, mysterious bird flew noiselessly over him, alighted on a cross at the other end of the cemetery, and sent its alarming cries over the sleepy village. Martin swore unbecomingly, shot at the black hanging belly of a cloud, and went home. On his return to the hut, his wife, a timorous ailing woman, as fruitful as a dough-rabbit, welcomed him with reproaches. "You're a fool, a hopeless fool," she declared. "The bird doesn't interfere with you, does it? What if God should punish you? Here am I, just up from my bed with my last, and supposing I get pregnant again through you." "Shut up, woman," Martin ordered her. "You'll get pregnant all right, never fear. What is the bird doing here, giving us all the cold shivers? It's calling down woe on us, the devil. If war breaks out, they'll take me off, and look at the litter you've got." He waved at the corner where the children were sleeping. Guards were set to watch over the meadow hay. The grass beyond the dawn was inferior to the hay of the steppe, and was sickly and scentless. It was the same earth, yet the grass drank in different juices. In the steppe there was a splendid black soil, so heavy and firm that the herd left no traces where they passed over it. On it grew a strong-scented grass, standing as high as a horse's belly. But along the dawn banks the soil was damp and rotten, growing a joyless and worthless grass, which even the cattle would not always look at. Haymaking was in full swing when an event occurred which shook the village from one end to the other. The district commissary arrived with an investigator and an officer in a uniform never seen before in the village. They sent for the ataman, collected witnesses, and then went straight to cross-eyed Lukieshka's hut. They walked along the path on the sunny side of the street, the village ataman running ahead like a cockerel. The investigator questioned him. "Is Stockman at home?" "Yes, Your Excellency." "What does he do for a living?" "He's a master locksmith." "You haven't noticed anything suspicious about him?" "Not at all." "Does he ever have visitors?" the investigator asked, pulling the ataman back. "Yes, they play at cards sometimes." "But who?" "Chiefly laborers from the mill." "But who, exactly?" "The engineer, the scalesman, David, and sometimes some of our Cossacks." The investigator halted and waited for the officer who had lagged behind him. He said something to him, twisting the button of his tunic with his fingers, then beckoned to the ataman. The ataman ran up on tiptoe with bated breath. "Take 2 militiamen and go and arrest the men you mentioned. Bring them to the administration, and we'll be along in a minute or two. Do you understand?" The ataman drew himself up and turned back to execute his instructions. Stockman was sitting in his unbuttoned vest, his back to the door, filing a design on veneer. He glanced round as the officials entered and bit his lip. "Please to get up. You're under arrest," the investigator ordered. "What's this for?" "You occupy 2 rooms?" "Yes." "We shall search them." The officer walked across to the table, and with a frown picked up the first book to hand. "I want the key of that trunk," he said. "To what do I owe this visit?" "There'll be time to talk to you after." Stockman's wife looked through the doorway from the other room and drew back. The investigator's secretary followed her in. "What is this?" the officer quietly asked Stockman, holding up a book in a yellow cover. "A book," Stockman replied with a shrug of his shoulder. "You can keep your witticisms for a more suitable occasion. Answer the question properly." With a wry smile, Stockman leaned his back against the stove. The commissary glanced over the officer's shoulder at the book and then turned to Stockman. "You're studying?" "I'm interested in the subject," Stockman dryly replied. "So." The officer glanced through the pages of the book and threw it back on the table. He looked through a second, put it on one side, and having read the cover of the third, turned to Stockman again. "Where do you keep the rest of this type of literature?" Stockman screwed up one eye as though taking aim at the officer and replied, "You see all that I have." "You're lying," the officer retorted, waving the book at him. "I demand, search the rooms." Holding his saber in his hand, the commissary went across to the trunk, where a pockmarked Cossack militiaman, obviously terrified by the circumstances in which he found himself, had begun to rummage among the clothing and linen. The man turned out everything that it was possible to turn out. The search was conducted in the workshop also. The zealous commissary even knocked on the walls with his finger-knuckle. When the search was ended, Stockman was taken to the administration office. He walked along the middle of the road in front of the militiamen, one arm folded across his old coat, the other waving as though he were shaking mud off it. The others walked along the path by the walls. Stockman was the last of the prisoners to be examined. Ivan Alexeyevich, with his hands still oily, guiltily smiling David, Valyat with his jacket across his shoulders, and Misha Koshevoy were herded together in the anteroom, guarded by militiamen. Rummaging in his portfolio, the investigator questioned Stockman. "When I examined you in regard to the murder at the mill, why did you conceal the fact that you were a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party?" Stockman stared silently over the investigator's head. "That much is established. You will receive a suitable reward for your work," the investigator shouted, annoyed by the prisoner's silence. "Please begin your examination," Stockman said in a bored tone, and glancing at a stool, he asked for permission to sit down. The investigator did not reply, but glared as Stockman calmly seated himself. "When did you come here?" he asked. "Last year." "On the instruction of your organization?" "Without any instructions." "How long have you been a member of your party?" "What are you talking about?" "I ask you, how long have you been a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party?" "I think that—" "I don't care what you think. Answer the question. Denial is useless, even dangerous." The investigator drew a document out of his portfolio and pinned it to the table with his forefinger. "I have here a report from Rostov, confirming your membership of the party I mentioned." Stockman turned his eyes quickly to the document, rested his gaze on it for a moment, and then, stroking his knee, replied firmly, "Since 1907. "So, you deny that you have been sent here by your party?" "Yes." "In that case, why did you come here?" "They needed a locksmith." "But why did you choose this particular district?" "For the same reason." "Have you now, or have you at any time, had any contact with your organization during the period of your stay here?" "No." "Do they know you have come here?" "I expect so." The investigator sharpened his pencil with a pearl-handled penknife and pursed his lips. "Are you in correspondence with any members of your party?" "No." "Then what about the letter which was discovered during the search?" "That is from a friend who has no connection whatever with any revolutionary organization." "Have you received any instructions from Rostov?" "No." "What did the laborers at the mill gather in your rooms for?" Stockman shrugged his shoulders as though astonished at the stupidity of the question. "They used to come along in the winter evenings to pass the time away. We played at cards." "And read books prohibited by law?" the investigator suggested. "No. Every one of them was almost illiterate." "Nonetheless, the engineer from the mill and the others also do not deny this fact." "That is untrue." "It seems to me you haven't the most elementary understanding of—" Stockman smiled at this, and the investigator concluded, "You simply do not possess a sound intelligence. You persist in denials to your own harm." This book is continued on cassette number 6, side 1.